This is it. We are in the final session of the Diversity Forum, and we are thrilled to be here with you today for the session, The Power of Story, Bridging Our Differences Through Empathy, Perspective Taking, and Perspective Getting. Want to have this opportunity to introduce ourselves before we get started. My name is Tammy Klumpian, and I am with the Office of Human Resources at UW-Madison. I have the privilege of supporting employee learning on campus, and I do that through a lens of inclusion, equity, and diversity in the Department of Learning and Talent Development, and I'm just really thrilled to be here with you today. Sheridan?
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Great to see all of you. Well, not see all of you, but see Tammy and know that you all are here. I am Sheridan Blanford. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Inclusion and Engagement for Wisconsin Athletics. And I'm a part of a team that does all things diversity, equity, inclusion. So I have the privilege of we have the privilege of being amongst the last. So I don't have to explain to anyone what that actually means. But our goal is to ensure that anyone, all of Wisconsin athletics stakeholders inside and outside of the department can come and be a part of what we do by just being them and creating environments for them to thrive. So really, really excited to be here with you all today.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to be here with Sheridan. It's been a great partnership in providing some learning together over the last few years, and I don't think we could have predicted when we met to work on our Diversity Forum submission. I think it was on a cold February day, Sheridan in a coffee house just off campus, how much 2020 would impact our individual and collective stories. We also could not have predicted that our session would be selected, or that we would be one of the final sessions of the two-day forum. And yet, as I often find to be the case, we are where we need to be. So we want to lift up a portion of Dr. Cheryl Gitten's opening remarks yesterday morning. She offered an invitation to all in her welcome to use the forum to reflect on our own story and to engage with other stories. And so Sheridan and I plan to use our time together, offer space for you together this afternoon to have considerations, have questions for yourselves, offer some strategies, and offer some processing time. As we are at the final end of our 2 days together, it seems like this would be a good space to do some processing, to give you time and space to consider now what. To really think about in a way that we sometimes stifle that, or try not to stifle that drift that often happens after we've been filled with learning and feeling and stretching in these learning opportunities like a diversity forum over 2 days. But we often find ourselves quickly moving back to the doing and the producing and the repeating. So our offering to you today in our final session with you today is to give you some processing time through some strategies, considerations, and questions that we want to offer you through this lens of story. So we invite you to grab a writing utensil and some paper to actively engage with us. We believe, and we've shown it over the last few days, that we can create community even in this virtual space. And we just want to invite you to consider the power of story through the lens of empathy, perspective taking, and perspective giving.
Awesome. So what we're going to start off with is some community intentions. I do want to commend you all. You all are the troopers who decided to hang in toward the last portion of the conference to spend it with Tammy and I, so we're incredibly thankful. I just want to start out by saying what this is and what this is not. Really encourage you to utilize your time to think about really pulling again all together what you've learned. You've gotten a lot of different perspectives, so it's really important that you can draw on those. And we're going to use, story and perspective pretty interchangeably throughout our time because our perspective influences our stories and our stories influence our perspective. So within that, just really being mindful of thinking about how you're intertwining that throughout your time or our time together. We invite you to be present. We're all very now used to this virtual space and understand that we can get kind of caught off guard and distracted. I am a huge, it happens to me often. We would love for you to be present with us for the next hour and some change. And if not, you got to do what you got to do. We totally know that, some folks need to stand up, might need to go grab a snack, use the restroom, grab some water. We recognize that that's okay too. Ask you to notice your thoughts and feelings. Again, utilize this as processing time from your from your entire experience through the diversity forum within the last 2 days. Be curious and then more curious. So you've leaned into that a lot during this time. We're just asking you to take just one more extra inch. And then the non-closure is that this work continues. You've heard this throughout the entire theme, is that what we're not going to change the world today. We're going to try, but we also know that what's going to happen today won't. We have to continue on and take this into our lives, as Tammy said, when we start to get back to the grind of applying this to our different spaces.
So for those folks who have a desire to know kind of how are we spending our time today, we offer a really brief roadmap. Our goal here is to have us leave with some mutual understanding of what empathy is, to think about perspective taking and perspective getting as a means to bridge difference across differences, and for us to start to unpack our own stories as well, to offer one strategy, there's many, but one strategy of deep listening, and then just to allow a lot of space throughout our time to just do some personal reflection within our own story and start to open up space for other stories as well.
Awesome. So what we're going to do is we are going to check in, and we are just hoping and praying and crossing our fingers that this works. But what I'm going to ask you all to do is pull out your phones. If you're on your phone, you can kind of do both and, but if you're on your desktop, your laptop, grab your phone and you are going to follow, this is an iPhone picture, but very similar if you have an Android or another type of phone, but you are going to type in the number 37607 in the to column, and in the body of the text message, what you're going to do is you're going to type in part of my name, Sheridan Bland 710. So SHERIDAN BLAN 710. So again, in the to, and this can kind of get confusing because it's like, okay, do I text Sheridan Bland? I want you to be very mindful of putting in the to section of the number, the contact, 37607, and then in the body, type in Sheridan Bland 710. And then you're going to hit send. So we're going to give folks just a minute or two, and we're just going to kind of talk back and forth, and then leave some open space. But then we will open up a different format, and we're gonna do a check-in live with everyone here. So. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the other screen. And again, if you have questions, we have a few folks that are here to support, but I'm going to go ahead and share our Pull Everywhere screen. All right, so we're up and out a different screen. So essentially what I'm going to have you do is the directions are still right up top there. This can be a little confusing how the website lists it out. But the number you're texting is 37607, and then in the body, Sheridan Bland, and it should pop up and say you're a part of a Pull Everywhere. So the first question that we are going to ask you is, how are you showing up today? How are you doing? So we got a lot of different emotions coming through, but we appreciate you being open and honest with us, trying new things, jittery. We appreciate that. Excited.
And a couple of exciteds on there.
Tired. Okay. Feeling stressed. Powerful. Good.
Powerful, like it.
Yeah, so there's a pretty strong theme of tired. And then, we just haven't energized to go on the other side of the spectrum, but we appreciate you all sharing. Yes. So these last few days have been lots of content, but it's still a lot to kind of unpack. So we appreciate you all showing up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, just by the sake of time, is I'm going to go ahead and go to our next slide. So very same question, or you're going to go about doing it in the same way. So what we're going to ask is, what is one thing that you're hoping to learn today about perspective taking and getting and empathy? Still have some stuff popping in from our last one.
Questions.
I think these are still rolling in.
Oh, good. People, everyone gets to put in their feelings, right?
Love the engagement. Love the engagement.
I think we're starting to get some motivation to want to learn, engage. Yeah. Distractible, that's real.
Yeah. So this is good. Screen time, but inspired by this conference. Yes. What perspective taking giving is. Here we go. I think that we're at the, we're starting to get into this question. So thank you all for your patience. How to be a better listener. Yes. Great. Have more of it. Yes, absolutely. The perspective piece of it. Insight. Yes, this is good. Acting. Yep. Tactics. Yes. Hopefully to provide some real life things that we can provide you with. How to step back. Yes. Pause.
Gentleness with myself. We'll be talking about that.
Yeah. Great. Not sure. Well, hopefully you will be sure once we leave. To not get overwhelmed and burnt out. Better listening. Absolutely. All right. Next steps. All right. So just with the theme of how the other one goes, I'm going to go ahead and move to our next question, recognizing that things will still kind of be piling in. But our next one is what I want you to do by way of the story theme is to really ground yourself and think about your personal experience. So think of a time or an incident in your life, whether that was in your personal life, your work life, in your relationships, where you did not feel valued, heard, or expected, or respected. And what we're going to ask is, what feelings did that bring up for you? So thinking about the emotional side, like how did that make you feel when you were in this scenario, a part of your story, what has prompted who you are? What were some of the emotions that came up for you when you did not feel like you were valued, heard, or respected? So you heard anger, I think pain, empty, embarrassed, doubt, frustrated. Yes. Yes.
Sheridan, it sounds like there might be a limit to how many responses Pull Everywhere is taking. So for those that aren't able to get those in, we apologize. That is a nuance that we may not have been aware of. So we weren't aware of. So, part of this is also just to spend some time reflecting for yourself and to think about these feelings that are coming up for you as we ask these questions. just check in with yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, Tammy, and apologize for our technical difficulties, but we appreciate your patience. So some of the main themes that came from this is that it caused a lot of frustration, caused anger, some embarrassment, some anxiety, some shame. And I think a salient message is no matter who we are, no matter what our identities are, that in some capacity we've all felt this feeling. And we don't want to, we don't want to put other folks in a space to feel this way. We want to create environments that reflect culture of allowing people to feel valued, heard, and respected. Because again, even if we don't have similar identities to others that we might be extending toward or trying to take their perspective, it's really important that we ground ourselves in knowing what this feels like, and then, allowing that to kind of guide where we're going to go. So Tammy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share our PowerPoint again, and we can jump right back in. But we appreciate you all indulging in that, and I'm glad that it actually worked out. So thank you. Awesome. All right.
So, we want to start connecting the dots here, and that check-in practice is a part of being able to show up with empathy and perspective. We have to check in with ourselves to really understand those feelings, whether it's how we're feeling in the moment or how those feelings might be connected to past experiences that are being projected or inferred when we reintroduce ourselves to similar situations or interactions. And so that's a part of the practice, that taking 30 seconds to just check in, or thinking about past experiences where you might have greater empathy for someone because you might be connecting with a similar situation that they're going through in terms of feeling. Dr. Brene Brown has done a lot of research on shame and on guilt and on empathy. And Sheridan and I like to use her definition. We think it's a really digestible and user-friendly definition for empathy: simply listening, holding space, withholding judgment, emotionally connecting, and communicating that incredible healing message of "you're not alone." We would like to try to show you a 4-minute video, have us all engage in that together. And as we're getting ready to show that, I want to invite you, if you are in your seat right now or listening and you're going, "I've seen this video like so many times," I want to invite you to look at it through a different lens, to think about the last 2 days, to think about equity, inclusion, diversity, and the work that you are committed to, and think about empathy through that lens as you listen to this and watch this video.
Empathy feels connection, sympathy feels disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. She lives in Madison with emotions. His son, his sections, very good expectations. Perspective taking, you'll be able to take the perspective of another person, but recognize the perspective of themselves. Staying in the judgment, not enjoying as much as myself. Recognizing emotions that people can't empathy is forming the way you feel. And to realize that empathy is just kind of separate space and feeling deep fear,
All right, so we are getting some messages that we're having some trouble with the audio. So in the spirit of Zoom and all the things, hey, we're here to troubleshoot. What we're going to do is we're going to share the video link in the chat, or we'll follow up with it. You can just type in Brene Brown empathy video in YouTube as well if you wanted to access a little bit quicker. But thank you for your patience on that. But we're going to go ahead and derive some themes because we prepared for this moment, Tammy.
Oh my goodness. Well, we have lots of feels right now, and the feel I'm holding is that I know folks know what it's like to be in the space of uncertainty in virtual space. So I'm inviting an extension of grace as we move through here, and I'm going to hold that y'all are appreciative of this. So, and I understand that someone shared the link in the YouTube chat, so thank you for doing that as well, and apologies for that. But we can still talk about Brene's work because it's really powerful work as we think about this idea of empathy in connecting with others. So empathy is really about that perspective taking. It's about staying out of judgment, trying not to do the comparison game with my story versus your story. Really recognizing the emotions of others and meeting those emotions, trying to meet that emotion and getting curious about that so that we can then have connection with somebody. We're connecting with somebody. On the other side of that is sympathy. And so sympathy doesn't necessarily make that connection. It really is more about trying to help or problem solve, trying to fix. It's not about the connection of wanting to understand what that person needs in that moment and being there for them. And you will notice one of my favorite things in the video and in the definition that Brene shares is this idea of silver lining it, trying to make it better by silver lining it. And the famous words that I take from that every time I hear it, and I can hear it over and over again and learn something, is the at least. And I feel like right now, as I think about this story of 2020, there's the potential for a lot of at leasting going on, and trying to avoid that if we want to move more towards empathy versus sympathy. So empathy is about connection. It's about fueling that connection, and sympathy drives disconnection because there's not that humanity piece there, that humanness that we're wanting to connect with another. Really want you to keep that in mind as we talk about this idea of bridging differences and understanding and connecting with folks who may have different stories than our own. We want to move and lead with empathy in that process. But we first have to start with ourselves. And so Sheridan's going to walk us through that.
Yeah, so just to touch on this briefly, and I think that this is something that Tammy and I have found a lot of value and had a lot of great feedback from, is this whole notion of self-empathy. Because I know before we really dove into this, how I thought about empathy is it's very much how I'm interacting with others and how I'm showing support to others. But as Tammy and I got to talking, very similar to what we did in that check-in, is thinking about how we are showing, like, what does self-empathy mean and how do we show ourselves empathy? It really is important to think to start with self before we then start to interact with others. So before we start to think about how this translates into interacting with others, particularly those that are different from us or have different stories, I want us to really kind of grapple with this self-empathy piece. So how I define self-empathy, very similarly to how Brene lays it out, is it's just really paying attention to emotions, not holding judgment to yourself, which I think during this time is really difficult for a lot of us because we're used to doing one thing and we maybe not have the capacity or just the desire to do the things that we normally do. But it's really about holding space for that and then being able to kind of grapple with that, to think, to really be determined about how you show up and what you do in your life. So we're going to ask that this is a portion of our this is one of our multiple self-reflections throughout our time together. And I would love if you all would just take a moment outside of just kind of the whole diversity forum theme. I really want you to just take a moment to check in with yourself and think about what is one way that you have exercised self-empathy for yourself during this time. And I want you to, if you can, utilize the chat function to really indulge us in some of those things. So not as fancy as my friend Nestic and having background music, but nonetheless, we hope that you all will utilize the chat function, and we're going to engage you that way. All right, so then the second question that we want to ask based off of that is, what have you noticed about yourself when you exercise self-empathy, when you're paying attention to yourself, when you're showing up for yourself, when you're creating space for yourself, when you're paying attention to your emotions? What do you notice about yourself when you do that? Then on the flip side, what have you noticed about yourself when you don't show self-empathy? And think about it again, particularly from a lens of the times that we're in.
And I'm grateful, Sheridan. I have a wonderful colleague. I know we both do have colleagues in the space who are helping us because we can't see chat.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to my colleague, Teresa. Thank you. I'm going to call her out because, we got to appreciate folks that, we've got some offerings of reminding myself it's okay to not be okay, creating space to feel and process emotions instead of pushing them away. Definitely that check-in, taking breaks isn't laziness. I think that's really powerful.
Yes.
One that we see often, Sheridan, taking walks, not comparing, not playing the comparison game.
Yes.
No.
Yeah, those are all, I think, themes that we can, in some capacity over the last 8 months, tie ourselves to, right? Because, and before I jump in, is there anyone that's particularly shedding light on what happens when they don't show themselves self-empathy yet?
I haven't seen that yet.
We'll wait patiently.
Do you have feelings, Sheridan, when you don't show yourself empathy?
Yeah,
for you?
I think I can really relate to the person who says, really paying attention rather than pushing it away, because I think that that's sometimes easy to just keep going. But I know I compartmentalize a lot, and then I usually get to a point where, frankly, the cap's about to bust, and whoever's like in the line of fire, bless you, because you don't know what Sheridan you're gonna get. But I really think that I'm not my best self because I'm just trying to keep going, and I'm not pausing to give myself an opportunity to really work through those emotions and how they're impacting me, therefore not giving myself the opportunity to let go or move past or really acknowledge those feelings. So that's what happens with Sheridan. What about you, Tammy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a few coming in here that I resonate with, the idea of loneliness or even feeling alone. I can feel it in my body sometimes, and if I don't notice it, if I don't take the time to notice it, I can dismiss it for something else. But then I realize that it might be some of that lack of self-empathy. I think the tiredness is coming up a lot in chat too, which was shown in our check-in. And as we're talking about this, I'm reminded of Austin Channing Brown this morning and how she talked about the burnout, that if we don't show ourselves empathy and we don't find joy and in something, infuse joy into our lives in this work in particular, how important that is. So I'm thinking about that in terms of self-empathy too. And someone mentioned, which might be a nice lead into the next part of this, is that self-empathy leads to empathy for others.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, whoever you are. I appreciate you. But no, that's exactly why we wanted to start with this, because I think we often, again, really think about how we interact with others and how we show support. But if we don't check in with ourselves and know how we're showing up and how that might then play a part in that interaction, we're doing service not only to ourselves but to the other person, particularly if that other person is from an underrepresented identity and we are trying to show empathy for an experience that they have that we might not have. The way we're feeling, we don't know how that's being portrayed or how that's showing up with our desire to show empathy. So I think it's really important that as we are doing this work, aside from, diving into research articles and reading books and watching TED Talks and all that stuff, like you have to really check in with yourself. How's life going to really play a part in how this interaction or this engagement is going to go with someone? So just to finalize that, self-awareness can not only increase our understanding of how we treat and interact with others, but first and foremost, it allows us to stop and check in with ourselves and consider how we are showing up. So we are going to jump into the next portion. And just to end off real quick, you can't pour from an empty cup. So that's just, I think, something to share in general. Is what we learned from Austin this morning, is that you have to find ways to fill your cup, particularly for our marginalized and underrepresented communities. But this is where we also start to get into, you can't pour from a cup that you don't know what is in your cup. You have to know what you're pouring out into other people's cups and know if that's what they need. So what we're going to do real quick is we are going to debunk some of the myths of empathy. And we're going to tie into some of the things that Brene talked about. And I'm going to really tie this example into, let's pull ourselves back, as Tammy was talking about. These last 8 months have been incredibly trying and chaotic and like unknown for the entire time that we've been a part of it. But I want to take us back to May when George Floyd was brutally murdered, and essentially what then came thereafter. And I'm going to use that as kind of our ground to unpack some of these myths of empathy. So this first one is a myth of empathy, is that pretending the challenge is non-existent will cause less pain. So through my personal experience, through experiences of others that I've spoken with, there was this very hard line in trying to figure out how do we acknowledge that this took place. And oftentimes, because people didn't know what to say, they didn't want to say the wrong thing, or they weren't educated enough to really know how to really help people, particularly from the Black community. A lot of people kind of leaned on the fact that, hey, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to cause more pain. However, this is a myth. I'll say first and foremost, you have to educate yourself leading up to hopefully these situations just stop by way of the world we're living in. We know that they're not. But you have to educate yourself on what's going on. And this diversity forum has given us a really good diving board, but we have to keep going. Nonetheless, you have to educate yourself. But second of all, there's a lot of power in acknowledgement, because if you're not acknowledging how something might be impacting my experience, particularly as a Black woman with the George Floyd situation, you are taking a part of who I am. If we just continue business as usual, that doesn't acknowledge how I'm showing up and how this is impacting my ability to be present and work, because frankly, it's impacting everything. So there was a lot of things going on social media that folks weren't being acknowledged. No one was saying anything. And that's an issue. So that's a myth. Be mindful of acknowledging. You might not have all the answers, but don't just pass over something as if it's not happening because you are scared of causing more pain. There's a second one, I think this taps into what Brene Brown says, is another myth of empathy, is that there is always a need to respond. So I'm guilty of it, that oftentimes when someone's telling me something, particularly something that I can't relate to or that makes me uncomfortable, my initial response is to try to respond in a way that like silver lines a situation or makes a situation better or tries to provide a perspective. But I will tell you that that is not what you need to do. You have to be very thoughtful in if you're learning about something or trying to get a different perspective from someone, or the door is open to have a conversation, you don't always have to respond. You don't always have to have a solution, because in a lot of cases, particularly with the George Floyd situation, you don't have a solution. But be mindful of acknowledging it and then not always jumping to the, well, it's going to be okay, or we're really proud of the way our society is going and standing up for racism. That's not received well, particularly from the Black community. Number 3, I have to have the same identities as someone to empathize. That's also a myth. And I think I've heard this theme throughout, is that, oh, because I don't have your identity, I'll never understand what it's like to walk in your shoes. While that is true, that is absolutely true. And Tammy and I have lots of conversations about this. While Tammy is a white woman and will never understand what it's like to walk in a Black woman's shoes, as I am Sheridan, what people often do is they use that as an excuse to opt out of actually trying to build connection and relationship. It's almost like okay, well, I said I will never understand, but then they don't do the extra work that needs to come after that to actually try to work toward understanding, which we'll talk about later. So don't use that as an excuse to say, because I don't have the same identities, I can't fully empathize with your experiences. And another one similar is if I have different lived experiences than another, I have to ask a lot of questions before I can empathize. I think a lot of my Black and brown colleagues throughout this time can probably empathize with this statement, is that just because you don't have the same identity as me, that doesn't mean that I am here to educate you. I think that there's been a lot of talk throughout the diversity forum about underrepresented communities educating majority folks on their experiences. It's not up to underrepresented communities to do that. So you have to be thoughtful and pay attention. And we're going to talk more about, Tammy's going to unpack that a lot, about paying attention and being mindful of cues and body language and how folks, where their eyes are going, if they're smiling or they're not smiling, just being very mindful. But you don't have to ask a lot of questions because it's not often your place to do so. And then lastly, empathy can be passive. And how I couple this in, particularly with the social justice lens, is passive empathy is sympathy. And I will say, particularly from a place of true empathy, I believe that empathy is not a one-time interaction. Empathy is built over time. And my trust in your empathy as someone from an underrepresented community is going to come by way of how you show up consistently. So with the George Floyd incident in mind, I had a handful of colleagues particularly reach out to me and say, I'm really, really thinking about you during this time and holding you up. And while that's great, and I appreciate you reaching out in some capacity, I also I feel that that's very sympathetic, because you realize that there's a challenge and I might be impacted, so you're then reaching out. But someone like Tammy, who I have built an incredibly great friendship, trusting, loving relationship, I know, because Tammy does her own work. She does this for a living, so I know that she's in the game. She's done her own work. And over our time, our friendship, we've built an incredibly strong, trusting relationship. So when Tammy reaches out to me and says, Sheridan, I'm holding space, I'm thinking about you, let me know if you need anything, that's real. So I say that true empathy is built with trust, and it's built over time. So it can't be passive. It can't just be I'm trying to empathize with you and your experience. It's up to the underrepresented communities to really determine if they feel that empathy is real. So just know that that's what I will end with, is it's grounded in longevity and the ability to build trust over time.
Yeah, so what you're hearing is Sheridan sharing, and I always appreciate Sheridan's perspective as we continue to do this work together, is that to build that empathy and that connection requires relationship building. It requires trust. And as we all know, that's not going to just happen over a quick check-in or even a long check-in. It's something that has to be built by starting to bridge through an understanding of perspective and seeking to understand somebody else's perspective. And so to kind of move us, because empathy is important and it's valuable in this work, and it can't just be about empathy. It has to be about more than that. So I'm going to invite you again to pull out that pen and paper and do some self-reflection. What I'd like to do is I'm going to give you a minute, so we'll have some silence here, and I'll time it to keep us on track. But I'm inviting you to draw a picture of what comes to mind when you hear or see the word home. So just on your paper, just start drawing, picture whatever comes up for you in a minute. When you hear or see the word home, we'll be silent for a while you do this. Okay, I'm going to gently bring us back into the collective space. There was no expectation of Picasso drawings here or even completed drawings, but just to give you time to start to think about this idea of home. And what I want to invite you to do, and we obviously can't be sharing this collectively together, but more some self-introspective work, is what came up for you as you were drawing your picture? What came up for you when I made the invitation to draw the picture? What images, what feelings, what memories, what people maybe, what words? When you think about that and you think about the idea of home, home is a commonly understood word. We have a common academic understanding about the definition of home, really cross-culturally. Different language, but a pretty clear understanding of what that means. And yet, whenever I facilitate this exercise, and I invite people when we can to share their drawings or share out what came up for them with feelings and thoughts and people and images, there's never been a replica of one shared to another. They're always different and often drastically different. This is perspective. One word, but differing feelings, thoughts, experiences, ideas. Multiple truths for one word that we commonly understand. Perspective, as we connect empathy and perspective, you'll often hear the idea of putting yourself in another person's shoes. This is the idea of really trying to empathize with how someone else's lived experience or their values, their needs connect, to make that connection with emotion, and start to connect it with your own story. Empathy is an other focused emotion. So it draws our attention outward. We are truly practicing empathy when we put our attention on the other person and we're trying to understand their experience, thus putting on another person's shoes. But to truly create space to bridge and leverage difference, which often comes up, and Sharon mentioned it's a myth if you think you can't empathize with someone who has a different lived experience. We need to have perspective. We need to invite perspective. And in order to do that, we have to create space for story, to really dig deeper into understanding and seeking to understand. So empathy is the emotional connection that has us pause and notice. But you likely had some feelings and emotions as you thought and drew your home. But perspective taking, that's the conscious and intellectual work around empathy. It's having us really think about the ideas of our own story and being able to start to connect that conscious work to understanding that somebody else has a similar idea of a home or has an idea of a home, but their ideas are different. And that's conscious work. We have to, that's the 1-2 punch of empathy and perspective taking. We have to be able to train our brains to take the time to think about that, to think about putting ourselves in another person's shoes. So let's talk about the power of the mind really briefly to understand why this is difficult. It's difficult to move from empathy to perspective taking. So let's think about this in terms of when somebody says something that is in conflict with your own perspective, with your own lived experience. And you have this image of the brain here, the mind on your screen. When that happens, a stimulus is created and it travels to the brain and enters the brainstem. And it moves up to the center of the brain, you'll see there, kind of in the center. That is our amygdala, our emotional center of our brain. And there is a lot of historical emotion in that amygdala. When we are in conflict with our perspective of somebody else's perspective, that stimulus can swirl. It can swirl in that emotional center, that amygdala. And we can have an emotional reaction to that can look like, as you are likely familiar with, fight, flight, or freeze. So think about right now, the context of what we're in now, lots of perspectives, lots of lived experiences. And if stimuli are constantly created by the information that we're getting or the interactions that we're having, and that stimuli moves to the amygdala and we're swirling, there is not a lot of opportunity for connection, for empathy, and for perspective taking. When we engage in conflict with our own perspective, we engage in stress. That's stressful to us in our minds. And our brain has been wired to react to that. It's just inherently going to happen. So we have to stop that from happening by pausing. But it's a choice. It's not going to happen. Even after we practice it more and more, it becomes better and it becomes more habitual, but we have to engage in the practice. We have to. Because what happens is when we allow for that stimuli to move from that emotional center and we say, wow, I'm noticing and naming this emotion, which we practiced earlier, right? And I'm going to pause for a moment because I can tell my body's giving me this sensation. I'm going to react to this conflict of perspective. I'm going to allow that some time for me to have some logical thinking about this, to open up to the idea of, what do I want to hear more about? That's different and it's interesting. What am I curious about? That's the conflict that happens between the logical and the emotional center of the brain that leads to emotional intelligence. That's where the pause can happen. That pause has to be intentional though. And when we do allow for that, we can avoid that fight, flight, or freeze mode that we tend to go into when we're having conflict of perspective and not open to empathy. I want to add another piece of information that I think is really fascinating and doing some research. This idea of fight, flight, or freeze, we sometimes think is our only option that we've our minds have been wired to use in reacting to differing perspectives or conflict or stress. Actually, there is some work that's been done by a woman early 2000s, Dr. Shelley Taylor out of UCLA, and she did some work on emotional intelligence and stress management and regulation of women in particular, and also female mammals. And her research concluded that for some, particularly women, under stress or in conflict, a natural response, rather than fight, flight, or freeze, is tend and befriend. Tend and befriend. The tend is to that least powerful or marginalized in the group. So in her research, and as she continued to look at it, was about those that were most vulnerable. And the befriend was to create groups of belonging, to really use that response mode, that pause, to find common ground and a sense of community. The use of empathy and perspective taking allows us to, in the pause, tend and befriend, to open up a story other than our own and get a different viewpoint of others with different perspectives and opinions. Think about that, tend and befriend. How could we start to really engage in story sharing and bridging those differences? But we have to understand that we see the world through our own lens. Our story is a lens that is based on our own perspective. So in order to offer you some framework to start thinking about your story, and the importance of starting with our own story to create space for other stories, we want to offer you a framework. This framework was designed by Shaquille Chaudhry, co-founder of Animal Leadership in Toronto, Canada, and author of the book, Deep Diversity. And this is a framework that I think offers us an opportunity to engage in unpacking our own story. So just as I'm kind of walking through this, I want to invite you to think about, and if you want to draw this on your paper and start to kind of consider your story as you think about the work that we've done over the past couple of days and what you've become more maybe aware of, even in listening to others' perspectives and stories. I think that this framework can really help you, and it helps me intentionally and continually unpack my story as I interact with others. Others whose stories are different than mine, even others whose stories are somewhat familiar to mine, knowing that all of us have different perspectives. So this starting from the bottom, and if you see this kind of as a mountain, this reminds me when I think about my identity and history that I am a white, cisgender, able-bodied woman who grew up in a small, all-white rural community, raised by 2 educators and taught by teachers who looked like me, went to school with students and friends and peers who looked like me. And that has informed, as we move up, my values. I've had to unpack my values around education and my learned value of conflict avoidance. So unpacking that. And that further informs my understanding of what my needs have been in terms of my story, my desire and need for continuous learning, having been raised by 2 educators who created space for that, and through that learning, learned perfectionism and having to unpack that. So this all leaves me with simultaneous feelings of growth and challenge that I have to continually think about as I'm interacting with and opening up space for other perspectives than my own, other stories than my own. This doesn't mean that my story is wrong or right, that my values don't have goodness in them. They do, but it certainly does give me space to start to question them and think about them further as I listen and learn from other perspectives and stories, and realizing that my story is limited. It's limited to just my story. So perspective taking, being able to see and feel things from somebody else's point of view is valuable in us being able to build this bridge, but we have to first understand clearly our own perspective, and that takes time and effort. And I hope you had an opportunity to start to think about that over the last few days and through this framework as well. It's not the last point, though. We have empathy and perspective taking. Now let's talk about perspective getting. Sheridan?
Yes, awesome. So I really think that that's when Tammy shared this framework, I think it unpacks it very well to think about how we arrive at where we are at. And essentially what you have to do to get perspective is, while you have to, first of all, climb up your own mountain, because we realize that this work is very much starting with self. If everyone takes care of themselves and then projects that to their sphere of influence, well, then the world changes. So we all have to really focus on starting with self. So if you start with yourself and understand how Tammy kind of climbed up her own mountain, what you then have to do is you have to climb down your mountain to the bottom of someone else's mountain, and then climb up to then understand where they're at. And I used an analogy yesterday with Tammy, particularly in the frame of a story, is that we are all books. Our lives are all books. And what often happens is we meet somebody and interact with them on a specific chapter, on a specific line, and a specific word. And usually we interact with that person on that word, whatever that word as a part of their life is telling us, whatever's happening in that moment. And we're interacting with them based off of that. However, what we don't usually do, unless we take the intentional time to figure out, first of all, building a relationship, doing our own work, and then continuously learning, is to really figure out in that book, what's the word before, or what does the line above, what does the paragraph above say? What's the chapter behind say that I have no idea that's influencing the way this person might show up? So as you're thinking about really kind of climbing up your own mountain and saying like, okay, how did I arrive at this? This is where I'm at. Then you have to climb down your mountain. And then when you're getting to know someone or trying to get someone else's perspective, you have to start at the bottom of their mountain and climb up their mountain with the same framing. So in the spirit of what Tammy asked you to kind of start thinking about, we're going to spend a little bit of time to allow you to do this for yourself. So what we want you to do is we want you to climb up your mountain. So through this process, I'm going to give you probably 2-3 minutes. Tammy, do you think that's okay? Because we want to leave a little bit of time at the end. Because you know us, we'll just get to chatting. Nonetheless, about 2 minutes, and this is not, what this is not to do is to just be like all encompassing. We just want you to think about like where you're at right now. Maybe some few components very similar to what Tammy shared that you can add about your own story. So we want you to think about what are your identities? What are some of your identities? What are your values and how are your values shaped? What are your needs? Maybe it's this very moment. Maybe you're thinking about this from a professional frame. You know, what are your needs? And then how are those influencing your feelings? How are your feelings showing up? We heard a lot of tired. We heard some excited. We heard some just like drained, empty. How are all of those things influencing your feelings? So we're going to give you just 2 minutes to go ahead and do that. And then we will jump to the next portion. So happy reflecting.
Tammy and Sheridan, this is Gail. I just wanted to let you know that I'm putting some questions in our Zoom chat since you all can't see the live chat to try to help the flow of information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to give you about 30 more seconds, and then we're going to jump to the next portion of this. All right, so again, as we start with ourselves and have been kind of hitting that home throughout this entire time, what we are now going to do is move to the other person. So we need you to climb down your mountain, so come back down. But what we're going to ask you to do is think of, over your time at the Diversity Forum, because I know if you're anything like me, you gained a lot of different perspective that you did not have. Even as I always say, even as DEI professionals, we come to these things and we learn incredible things too. So what I want you to do is think of a story, a perspective, or an identity that you've heard about over the last few days. And or if you can't think of something over the last couple months that is different from your own. And I just want you to take a few seconds to identify what that is. Something that's different from your own. Alrighty, so in the spirit of trying to climb someone else's mountain, we are going to ask you to do the same exact thing and keep your identities keep your mountain in your mind. But what I want you to think about is what are the identities in that story or of that particular person that are different from your own? What identities might not be visible? What are the values and the experiences of that person or the folks in that story and what shaped them? What are their needs? And last but not least, how are they showing up? And what are they feeling? So give you just 1 minute. A lot of these you probably aren't going to be able to answer full on because this is going to be your work after you. I think that was the beauty of what Tammy and I talked about is being the last, is that we have the privilege to really kind of unpack and bring it into one space. But this is going to be your roadmap, essentially, to be thinking about how you are going to take what you learned and translate that into your working environment. How are you going to take your perspective, your mountain, how you show up, and translate that into getting a perspective from someone else? All right, so with that, again, these slides will be shared, so if you need this outline, you'll be able to go back and view it. But we are going to go ahead and move forward. Go ahead.
So we're closing in on the final piece here, and that is perspective getting. So I know for me, this is a new way of looking at this work. I was really focused for a long time on this idea of connecting empathy and perspective taking. And if we can do that, that's that 1-2 punch we talked about earlier. And as I've dug more into the research, it's actually showing that that isn't even just enough, and that we have to do one step further, and that is get perspective. Particularly, the research shows particularly for groups that are marginalized, underrepresented in spaces, or do not have the power within spaces, lack power within spaces, or vulnerable. We have to make space to get perspective. Because what happens in the perspective taking as you're doing your mountain, climbing up yours, climbing down yours momentarily and up another's, is that you're still inferring and understanding what another person's perspective is through your lens, right? Through your filter. The more you engage in other story sharing, the more you stretch in that area, but we still have to make sure that we're not just making that a quick perspective taking, that we're offering space to get perspective and for folks to really share their story. And so empathy helps us connect, perspective taking helps us pause, but to truly create space for stories, we need to engage in perspective getting, taking the time to get to know an individual as a human being through their story, not through intuition or inference filtered through my story. So one strategy, this is one strategy that we are offering for you to think about if you want to engage in more perspective getting, is the strategy of deep listening. So there's lots of different types of listening, right? There's not listening, which I feel like sometimes is happening a lot right now. There's selective listening, which is listening to folks who are affirming and validating my experience and my perspective and opinion. There's active listening, which we are all probably very familiar with, the idea of listening to someone and then restating and summarizing and paraphrasing, questioning and probing further. And that is valuable. But for us to really open space humbly without any preconceived notion of what is going to be shared or want of what is going to be shared, deep listening. Deep listening is that paying attention that Sheridan talked about earlier to the emotional resonance of an interaction with curiosity. So deep listening is paying attention to the emotional resonance of an interaction with curiosity. It can be hard. A lot of things get in our way, interferences, wanting, we have this unconscious going back to the brain. We want to judge, we want to educate, we want to compare, we want to correct, we want to console or advise or problem solve. Deep listening requires us in that pause to say, I'm going to be here truly to humbly listen. And that is it. So what that means, if we're using our mountain, again, as a frame of reference, it's listening for perspective as we invite that getting of perspective. listening for values and needs, for emotion and meeting that emotion, and trying to dig below the surface. This is sometimes the hardest part, and it may be where we actually start to choose to deeply listen, is digging below the surface of words or actions. So when they come, pausing and realizing I want to start from the bottom of the mountain here and allow someone to share their perspective. Deep listening can be really transformational. And I was reminded, and I'll share with y'all if you want to look this up, in a recent podcast interview between Simon Sinek and Dia Khan, who is a documentarian and self-identifying Muslim woman, made a documentary, White Right, Meeting the Enemy. And she details meeting with the leader of the nationalist organization, of the oldest nationalist organization in the US. And the fact that she got the interview in time was amazing, but the fact that after an hour interview, he invited her back was even more surprising. And she credits deep listening. She calls it radical listening. And she asked him, why did you invite me back? Why would you want to spend time with me when I'm actively educating against everything that you believe in? And he said, I've never had a conversation like this because this went somewhere else. Nobody has been willing to listen and nobody has shared with me their perspective. And I'd like to continue the conversation. That's transformational. And that didn't happen. He eventually left that organization. That didn't happen after an hour conversation. So please know deep listening is not a one and done. But if we continue to move in this direction of deeply listening and opening space for story, what could we be transforming? And getting at maybe Nola's point, what are some ways to build abundance of culture and story sharing and cultivating all that people are bringing into this space? I'm just going to put on the screen now some ways to practice perspective getting. Just going to briefly go over these. Acknowledging that all you know is not all there is to know. A great first point when you start to get those sensations in your body and you're swirling. Great pause statement. Approach with curiosity. Seek to know individuals as humans, not as spokesperson for others. Deeply listen and follow with the questions as Sheridan mentioned in the myth, what those might look like and sound like are important, being mindful about those, and intentionally seek out stories different from your own perspective. So we're going to kind of wrap things up here, and Sharon, you're going to share how to leave the door open.
Yes. So I'm a little click happy here. So sorry about that. So essentially, particularly with interacting with folks that have different identities from yours, particularly underrepresented identities, I want you to think about how you're getting a different perspective. We are not at all telling you to go run to the next person that you see and say, tell me your story. Don't do that. Don't do that. If you do it, don't cite us because we're not telling you to do that. But essentially view it like this, is that you are giving them the keys. You are going to hand over the keys. And at that point, they have the option with what to do with those keys. They can stand outside of the door, very much like this person in this picture. They can stick the keys in and maybe poke their head in. They could open the door and be having a conversation with you with the door wide open, or they might walk through the door and share everything. But what you have to be very thoughtful and mindful of is giving the keys to the person and allowing them to determine how much of their story, who they are, what they want to disclose to you is going to come through. And I will again say that this is going to be very much rooted in the relationship that you have and the trust that you have built. So just how to leave the door open, a few strategies. Pay attention to what you're feeling, noticing, hearing, again, listening, paying attention to yourself. Show gratitude. Thank you. Thank the person. If it's something that is not traditional or something that you've heard, something that might be uncomfortable for them, you have to thank them for that, for opening that up, because that's not oftentimes easy to share something that's, inside of you like that. Notice intention. Be very mindful of when you are opening up and you're trying to get a different perspective. Who is this benefiting? Oftentimes we are very curious, but you also then need to then directly tie that with the impact that can have on that other person, particularly if it's from a marginalized identity. So while you might want to know where, as basic as this example is, but while you might want to know where someone's name comes from, who is that serving? That's you. So be very thoughtful in the impact that you might have by asking a story. Last, this is the key, is you have to invite without expecting. Offer the space for continued continued sharing through humble inquiry, but be prepared that if you hand the person the keys, they might put them to their side and stand right there. They might not want to share their story, and you have to be okay with that. So finally, just to comb through some of our takeaways today, before we have just a few minutes for questions, is we want you to be able to recognize and name emotions. Take time to reflect on how you are showing up, because again, that's key to then how you interact with others. All that I know or all that you know is not all there is to know. Be intentional about figuring out what it's like to be in another person's shoes. Climb up your mountain, but down to really figure out what that's like. Perspective taking, seek to understand and not to be understood. Don't just respond. Be thoughtful about opening up the door. Let someone tell you their story. Don't try to then shape it to make you feel comfortable. Don't just take the perspective. You have to take the perspective you have to get the perspective. So this is really important as it relates to deep listening. And then finally, if you have heard one story, you only have heard one story. We all have our own stories. And while some of them might intermix or be similar, we all are our own people. It's really important that you recognize that, particularly with interacting with people who are different. So we will end with one of our favorite quotes, and I think that this is a great way to end the conference, by Maya Angelou, and she says, when you know better, you do better. So hopefully that you took something from today. We ask that you really take the time to reflect and really think about how you're going to take the great perspectives that were shared over the course of these last 2 days and put them into action as you go back into your working lives and real world lives tomorrow. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone. And Sheridan, I know we were hoping we'd have a few minutes left for questions, and we do. And thanks to Gail on the end. So maybe we can go through a few of these. We apologize if we don't get to all of them. I think we will be sent some questions, and we'd be happy to follow up. And please know, we often say, there is wisdom in the room. So there is wisdom in the chat box. So if anyone has thoughts or ideas to these questions as well, you all should be sharing with each other. But we are certainly happy to offer some thoughts. So Sheridan, one of the first questions here I see is referring to self-empathy. How does this work with dealing with judgment from others, supervisors and others? And how does this work with dealing with judgment? Oh, that's the same question. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. So I think that's a fantastic question. And I really think it's really important for you to pay attention to yourself and really determine what your needs are. Sometimes, when we do feel judged by others, and those of us from marginalized identities, and we're speaking up and speaking out, particularly during the time that we're in, it's not easy. But rather than just compartmentalizing, like I said, that I am guilty of, be really mindful of checking in with yourself, because the emotions that you're feeling are valid. And if you're feeling them, they mean something, and you need to pay attention to them. Because oftentimes, particularly underrepresented groups, we're taught to not feel, taught to just keep going, taught to keep moving, taught not to pay attention. So when you are feeling that, when those feelings are coming, I encourage you to pause and genuinely take time to really wrestle with what that means, and then determine what you need as it relates to, again, exercising some self-empathy to show up so that you can to fill your own cup, so that you can show up and do what you got to do in your workspace. So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that too, just a reminder, another part of emotional regulation and self-empathy is vulnerability. And, I invite everyone to think about, because vulnerability is hard, but remember that vulnerability is the measure of courage. It is a direct measure of courage. And so being vulnerable to give yourself empathy and be gentle for yourself, and to engage in this perspective taking and getting, which has a lot of feelings around it, is actually very courageous. And that's the work we need to be doing right now. Let's see, we have, I'm just going through these questions.
We'll go like 1 minute over.
Yeah.
So one at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and ask you this
one. Please.
So it was mentioned earlier to be mindful of the number of questions you ask to gain perspective, but one of the tips for perspective getting and deep listening is to ask questions. Can you clarify how you can ask questions in a way that doesn't seem overwhelming?
Oh, Sheridan, we've had this conversation, haven't we? Well, I'll offer up something really quickly, and then I would love to hear, I think everyone would love to hear your perspective too. I think the humble inquiry piece is key. It's going in with an opening of, often where I will lead with is, if you would like to share more or process this further, I would love to listen. And then that just gives an opening for further conversation. And I don't have to ask a lot of questions because the individual will just share what they are comfortable sharing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you are great at deep listening because you're my deep listening partner. She's phenomenal at it. And I can say that it's really rooted in the trusting relationship that we've built. Mm-hmm. That when I do share what's questions, Tammy can ask me questions, and I don't feel like it's coming from a place of self-interest because she knows I built a relationship with her. So I also think that it goes back to leaving the door open. You have to, that we can't, be in every situation where it's like, read what the person is, read their body language, read what they're saying. But it's really important to, if you ask a question or you humbly inquire and someone shuts down, then that's your cue to be like, okay, maybe not today, or maybe not ever. But you have to be very thoughtful in not just like going at it for like, what's my interest in this? You really want to know, but really also being creative with how you can get these perspectives. It doesn't always just come by way of me needing to ask you a specific question. There's tons of resources that you can take advantage of. So we appreciate that question.
Yeah, I feel like if we were on the Oscars right now, the music would be playing, right? And I can see Gail being like, okay, y'all.
It's a wrap. But with that, I think that we would love to serve as a resource for you. So if we didn't have the opportunity to answer your question, please follow up. But we appreciate your time. We appreciate y'all holding out on us being the last session. It's getting ready for dinner time. So we truly appreciate you and your time. And let's go out and make this world a better place.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your evening.